I want to welcome everyone, all of you who are joining from across the globe. This, for myself and Salim, Hook, and the rest of the team, is an incredibly important session, because what we're going to try to do today with you in the limited time that we have is, first of all, give you an update of where we are as Action Track 5 within the UN Food Systems Summit organization, in terms of how we are putting together some of our key thinking with a series of different experts from different parts of the world following different disciplines around game-changing solutions in the area of resilience. So we want to start off with myself just welcoming you, but then move into Martin Frick, who is deputy to the special envoy of the UN Food Systems Summit, is going to give us an update of how the Food Systems Summit is moving along the current process. What are some of the key deliverables, Martin, that you really see are important? And how do you see the resilience track fitting into this? Welcome.
Thank you very much, Sondrine and Salim and everybody who is prepared to spend time here. We are spending long hours these days looking at flat screen monitors, and I appreciate that all of you are taking the time to listening to us. I think I don't need to give a full overview over the summit, because we have done that before, but what you see in action is our commitment to be as transparent and as inclusive as we possibly can. And I can tell you that everybody who is working with this summit, including everybody you see on screen working with us, is really committed to make that as broad and as all of society as we can possibly do. Something I'm quite excited about, because beyond food systems, really a way that brings the UN into the 21st century and really having an impact. Let me recall, we have 5 action tracks. This is the open forum for the action track on resilience, and resilience is of course also underpinning everything we are doing. It has to. COVID is telling us this lesson, and much more, with climate change being with us and will be with us over the coming decades. Everything we do has to be climate proof, and building resilience is not only a thing that we are looking in one isolated action track, but it cuts across all 5 action tracks. The action tracks, as you know, is one part of our engagement process. Another very important one is now fully underway. That's the country level dialogues. And with the confirmations of Rwanda and Malawi just this week, we are now to 42 confirmed countries, and we have almost the same number in the pipeline. And I just want to use this opportunity to everybody who is listening to also encourage you to talk to your government and ask for the national dialogue, to check the summitdialogues.org website, and also consider the possibility of organizing independent dialogues, which are also taking off, not least to people like Divine, and I'm happy to see Divine also being in the audience for this webinar. Now let me zoom in to where we are in the process with the action tracks. We have first defined what the action tracks are going to do. There were 2 iterations of framing documents which you find online, and we came to you with a question: did we get it right? Is anything missing? What do you see is important that we maybe haven't seen? And we will continue to work in this spirit. Still, on our foodsystems.community site, we have questionnaires open. We are still inviting all of you to send us ideas, suggestions for big game-changing ideas. They might be new, they might be existing, which we will bring together and look at it with a set of criteria to make sure that they really live up to the spirit of a Sustainable Development Goal Summit. And that means that the overarching concern is really, as the SDGs are being framed, to leave no one behind. So we are looking into specific projects, solutions, into frameworks of action, whatever it might be, with the lens of, are these solutions really having opportunities to ensure equitable livelihoods? Do they advance universal health, human health, planetary health, animal health? Do they help us regenerating environmental integrity? Do they, and that's a very important point, work specifically for the most poorest and vulnerable? Do they work for people with disabilities, for young people, for rural women, for landless workers, for migrants, and so on? We are looking also into bold solutions. In a meeting that we had this week, someone said, there is a box labeled too difficult, and we cannot afford to have this box closed. We have to look into the options and solutions, even if they seem very, very difficult. So we need a true departure from existing practices, and we need to address that in the long term. What we are trying to build needs to be sustainable. It needs to work on the longer term. It needs to be ambitious, and it needs to bring the systemic change, because thinking around at the margins will not help us. We need to see particularly co-benefits, and that's the very point of a food system summit. This is why we are inviting the environmental community, the human rights community, the health community, and many more to be a part of the discussion, because this is not only a meeting of ministers of agriculture, although they are important and central, but this is a systems thinking effort. And I think in the resilience work stream, this is particularly clear. Not least, we are looking into the scale of the solutions we are trying to promote. And when we are looking at, I think in the meantime, almost 300 solutions that have been sent to us, we will also look at them with the possibility of clustering them, of strengthening them, of integrating much of the wonderful work that has been done by so many activists out there over many years, in order to give it a framing, to give it finance, to give it financial support, and to really work on the systemic change. And as you know, this is a summit which is convened by the Secretary General. And if you have seen his recent speech on the state of the planet, if you have seen what the Deputy Secretary General, who is the chair of our advisory council, has put out in speeches, believe me, we want to be ambitious, and we are not shying away from the difficult discussions. So when we are clustering and coming out with a first attempt to show you a short list of game-changing ideas and action frameworks, it's not that we are pulling a rabbit out of the hat and saying this is the solution. This is only the beginning of an engagement process with all of you. And as we did with the framing of the action tracks themselves, we will come to you and say, so this is what we believe would work. Did we get it right? Is there something missing? Is our lens correct? Are human rights at the center of our thinking? And we are looking forward to engaging with all of you all along this year, to the pre-summit and to the summit moment, and hopefully also afterwards. To conclude, I wanted to say that these open fora have proven to be a success model. And again, thank you for all of you participating. There is also our workspace, foodsystems.community, which enable you to actively engage and debate with the action tracks. And that space is also growing for young people to have a space, particularly for young activists to connect, for our champions, and increasingly, as we are going to country level dialogues, we will give the opportunity, particularly to least developed countries and communities who are lacking capacity, to have an online space to continue their discussions. All of that is to get your voice, to get your input, to get your criticism also, because it helps us to become better. And I'm very much looking forward to the discussions we are going to have this afternoon or whatever your time zone is. Thank you very much, and back to you, Sandrine.
Thank you so much, Martin. Very much appreciate your remarks, and in particular also letting people understand the importance of this process, the importance of the summit itself, but also the fact, as you said, and I think this is what myself and Salim and so many of us in the resilience track truly hold dear in the work that we're doing, that this has to be a systems approach. And when we talk about a systems approach, we don't only talk about it in terms of the food system itself, but also how can we influence other systems that are dependent and interrelate with the food system, which within the UN family, as you know, we've also spoken about how can we make sure that whatever we discuss in the context of the UN Food System Summit, we also present to governments and with key experts solutions at COP26 when we're talking about climate change, or when we're talking about the CBD COP and biodiversity, or when we're looking at trade and finance agreements in the G20 and the G7. So the interrelationship between what we do here when we talk about resilience is so fundamental at so many different levels. So very much appreciate having you here with us. I know you need to leave a bit early, but very much appreciate the work that you're doing and the fact that we can continue to have this open exchange through these forums in order to get through the important work that we need to get done. So I'm going to give you a bit of an overview as to where we are in the resilience track, and then we will have specific presentations given by each of our working groups that have been established to unpack some of the key game-changing solutions and also think through some of the key issues and tension points around resilience. So I think go to the first slide, please, Mimansha. In terms of our ambitions and our work streams, and I have two screens here, so it's not that I'm not looking at you, it's just that I'm trying to look at my screen that actually has the presentation. What we're trying to do is very much look at the resilience and the regenerative aspects of the food system to withstand increasingly what we see as our current shocks, both from a health and also from an environmental perspective, as well as future shocks. And we know that within that context, we need to look at a variety of different elements, including conflict zones, including understanding the complexity of certain key geographies and the topography and other issues. So we are trying to look at that within a systemic approach. We're trying to engage as many individuals and institutions and organizations. This is part of the reach out that we have, but through our own expert group, we are trying to do the same. If any of you would like to also participate in some of our discussions or feel that you really have some key thinking and also case studies that you would like to share with us, please do so in the chat, but also send it in to anyone from the team. And then we need to remember that what we are talking about here is that food systems have to address the root causes and the drivers of weak and disruptive food systems. So we have to take into consideration what we feel is fundamental: economic, social, environmental, and peace foundations. And that's why you will see that our kind of building of our thinking has been around these 5 core areas: environmental resilience, economic resilience, peace resilience, and social resilience, with an overarching cross-cutting thinking, which looks at all of those working together within a systems approach across the food system and the food value chain. Next slide, please. What are the objectives of the summit? The objectives are to prepare final, short, ambitious statements or key recommendations coming from the different action tracks that look both at the synergies and the trade-offs, to have evidence-based, not only in terms of science, and we do have our science committee that we work with, but also in terms of key case studies, in terms of key actions that have worked in practice, with whether it's changes in policy or governance or institutional changes. We need to clearly take into consideration the key knowledge gaps and then develop and identify, and this is where we are right now in the process, align game-changing and systemic solutions, in particular within the resilience track, but also in cross-fertilizing with some of the other tracks that are discussing some very similar issues, but that are more germane to their key theme. We have to foster and encourage and follow the alignment of existing initiatives. This is adding value to existing conversations, existing case studies, existing evidence, and really try to bring into the context of all of the international conversations, some of the national best-in-class examples. How do we create also champions of change within different countries and bring forward those country examples to the international fora? Most importantly, and I know that within the resilience track, what we find is most important is to ensure that whatever we do is not a talk shop, that this truly is going to influence, that this truly is going to have key post-summit outcomes, which will look at impact and also change implementation on the ground. So we see the summit as an important driver for this discussion, but not the endpoint of this discussion. Next slide, please. Our theory of change is the following. What we've tried to do, because many people have asked us, okay, how are you describing resilience? We've taken the definition of resilience from the UN Common Guidance on Helping Build Resilient Societies, which was actually just released in the autumn of 2020, where we are looking at the ability of individuals, households, communities, cities, institutions, systems, and societies to prevent, resist, absorb, adapt, respond, and recover positively, and that's quite a mouthful, efficiently and effectively when faced with a wide range of risks, while maintaining an acceptable level of functioning without compromising long-term prospects for sustainable development, peace and security, human rights, and well-being for all. And I'd like to end on the well-being for all. I think the key point that myself and the team truly want to stress is the idea here of resilience is how can we ensure that we do create a well-being society where most people have equitable access to food given as a human right, and also are able to continue that access to food as we start to have more shocks and crises upon us, whether they be health pandemics, whether they be conflict issues, etc. Next slide, please. So we've put together the resilience definition and the theory of change, which you've seen. And then we've also, in working with the science team, started to unpack what does that actually look like. So for us, again, we need to bring into the resilience thinking a lot of the work that is happening with the other action tracks. And so we are cross-fertilizing our thinking with the other action tracks and also their experts. But we are also within our action track, then bringing in all of that thinking, some game-changing solutions, issues around key barriers, and thinking about what are the trade-offs and synergies? What are our key ambitions? What are key solutions and what are key context pieces? How can we apply this to as many different geographies as possible, as many different localities as possible? And what we need to think about, as I indicated within that theory of change, when we're looking at food system resilience, is the fact that we have to anticipate, we need to prevent further crises, we need to absorb, so look at the possibility of the system to absorb shocks, adapt and transform, and then put that into a contextual piece and an operational piece. What does that mean on the ground? What does that mean in terms of the key actors that are relating with that particular system? What does that mean in terms of shifts with regard to our governance system, as well as the application of new technologies and new types of principles for change? And I think that that is where we get into our targeted solutions. Next slide, please. Before we come into the solutions, just to give you a quick oversight of how complex some of this is. I mean, not only is the food system complex, but the interrelationships between all the different parts of the UN food system puzzle is very complex. And we've been trying to look at all the different aspects of this and have relationships across different issues. So beyond our own working groups, also working with different levers of change, which are cross-cutting levers: innovation, finance, gender, human rights, feeding in and getting insights back from the science group, the member states where we have national dialogues, champions, all of which are coming from the NGO community and also from the private sector community. Next slide, please. This is the way in which we have split up the different working groups. We wanted to show you that we have these 5 key working groups. And again, if some of you feel that you have the time and inclination and truly the expertise to join one of these working groups, please contact us. We would be happy to bring you into this very important process. What we have tried to do is, in the working group members, split them up accordingly to their expertise, but also, as we indicated, very much make sure that we are looking at the key resilience points and cross-cutting factors. Next slide, please. So this has allowed us already to start a process, what we call the Game-Changing Solutions process. We have already sent out to all the experts we know, our different networks, a survey asking for what you think are what we would call game-changing solutions. And I will get into the process of evaluation of what those solutions are. But we have already received 122 responses that come from our own leadership team of experts, the UN task force, civil society groups, business, companies, as well as the community platform and also youth networks. Obviously, also we've received many of these inputs from member states, and you can see all the different types of responses that we've received. And this has been filtered into the different working groups to assess what for them, based on some very clear criteria, constitute game-changing solutions. What's important here is to also realize that we do, and we've tried to have as much geographical representation in some of the solutions as possible. And I'm very pleased that we have gotten quite a few responses from Africa, growing responses from Asia, and then of course from North America and Europe. Next slide, please. So how have we actually started to channel those solutions? What has the methodology been? The stage 1 was to bring in the inventory of all of the solutions that we received and to create that inventory within a large scale Excel spreadsheet and start to see whether or not they fit into particular resilience tracks for the working groups. We channeled those solutions to the working groups directly, and we have a chair for each of those working groups. And for the moment, the working groups have started to apply the criteria that we have received from the UN process to those different solutions to see what they believe are truly game-changing solutions. The idea is that we now have a first run on potential solutions. These have been consolidated. We will present them to you today, but this is definitely not the last run. This is only the beginning of a process, and we would love to have your comments. But I do think as we move into the next slide, we have all realized that what often these solutions have lacked is a depth of understanding, is a real comprehensive methodology in terms of how we can actually apply these solutions and why they're game-changing. Getting a better understanding of the impact that these game-changing solutions will have, the key actors that are necessary to make them reality, and also the types of solutions that we have to underpin in order to make them a reality as well, is incredibly important as we move forward. So what I'm going to do now is pass this over to our science team, and I think Preet is with us, and she can give us a bit of an update on what the science group has been doing as we've been exchanging with them. Preet, are you here?
Sandrine, I think Preet wasn't added as a panelist, so she may not be able to present.
Okay, so maybe what I'll do, and I apologize, Preet, that I'm presenting this on your behalf. It'd be much better if yourself or Ismahana would present it herself. But what the scientific group would like to communicate to the broader community is that first...
Sandrine, I think she might be here. Preet, are you here?
No, I don't see her.
No, you better go. Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
Okay. There is an independent group of researchers and scientists which are responsible for ensuring the robustness and the breadth and the independence of that science. But we do also, within our expertise, clearly have scientists who are part of the resilience leadership group. What the scientific group are doing is that they are creating teams for all the different subgroups and action tracks. And they have been working with all of us across the action tracks very closely to make sure that we synergize and that we have the proper evidence basis for the actions that we will be proposing at the UN Food Systems Summit in September. What they have done is many of them have started to look at key issues, key areas that need to have a real scientific assessment undertaken. And these are undergoing peer reviews and will be finalized by about mid-February, end of February. They've created also cross-cutting thematic policy briefs that are being developed by partner organizations. And they will be having a bonding science and policy to accelerate food systems transformation, which is actually happening right now and is why some of our science team cannot be with us, where they're looking very much at the science and policy elements. And I know that France is actually running one of these discussions today. Next slide, please. In terms of a very important part of the scientific process that some of you may want to participate in, there will be 2 half-day events of the UNFSS Science Day, and this will be on the 8th to the 9th of July. Normally hosted at the FAO headquarters, if we can all hopefully travel again. Otherwise, I assume it will be virtual. The idea here is to showcase the robust science and evidence underpinning sustainable food systems, to highlight the scale and the potential of systemic scientific opportunities, bring together all key stakeholders and partners, then strengthen the science policy interface, which is so important, science-based target making and science-based evidence being absolutely key as we move forward. And then there will be a series of parallel sessions also with the action tracks in order to make sure that we're fully optimized in the types of proposals that will be brought forward. Next slide, please. So I'm going to pass on to Mike Kunga, who I hope is still here. Yes, I see that Mike is here, who can give us a bit of an update also on some of our key activities around youth. Mike.
Hi, Sandrine. I hope you can hear.
I can hear you. You're now on mute, but I can't see you. There you go. Now you're muted off.
Unfortunately, okay. I'm not putting myself on.
Mike, you're coming in and out. Oh, I'm getting lovely music. Okay, Mike, maybe what I'll do, if you don't mind, and I'm so sorry because I know that we really wanted you to present the slides. Maybe the best is for me to present them for you because I can't hear you anymore.
Yeah. Probably if you cannot hear me, then you can just go on and present. I think the
I can hear you now.
is just quite explained.
Mike, we can hear you now. Why don't you just go ahead? Go ahead.
Go for it, and if you can now.
All right, thanks so much. Well, Action Track 5, I think we decided with the leadership team that we should have a youth resilience team. So I'm going to present on what I've done so far with the youth resilience team. In the first place, we had a meeting with the chair, Salim and Sandrine. So we agreed that we're going to have a team of 20 youth, and these youth will be working hand in hand with the Action Track 5 working groups, which are environmental resilience and the rest. So basically, as of now, I have 10 members, and my selection was based on the areas or states which are seem to be very fragile, like Yemen, Mozambique, Liberia, and South Sudan. So I'm here to have another round of 10 youth who I'm going to work together in the building up of the Action Track 5 resilience team. So the purpose, as I said, is we're going to be working hand in hand with the working groups, but at the same time, our focus is to ensure that within our region or within our states, we facilitate the youth independent dialogues, and we consolidate solutions from our areas and input into Action Track 5. At the same time, as the Vice Chair for Action Track 5, I'll be Gamechanging Solutions to see how they are reflecting issues concerning the youth. And the other thing is there's a global youth food charter, which has been developed by Food Foundation. And the purpose is to ensure that the youth have a voice in the global space. So I'll also be working on that together with my fellow Action Track 5 Action Track Vice Chairs. Yes, over to you, Sandrine. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Mike, and we're so pleased to have you as our youth vice chair. It's so important to bring in youth here, not only in terms of key actors in shifts within the food system, but also just the voice of the next generation, which is absolutely fundamental when we talk about resilience. So could I then now give you the solutions overview from each of the different chairs, and really appreciate all the positive comments in the chat. I'm pleased that actually you're appreciating this update, because it's not always easy to know how much information to give. So hopefully we haven't bored you yet. I'd like to start with Sherry Arnott of the Social Working Group to give us a bit of an overview of what's happening in the Social Working Group. Then we'll go to Dan Collison, who's doing the Economic Working Group, and go through then Dan Smith on Peace Resilience, Divine, who will give us the Environment Working Group update, and then the Cross-Cutting Working Group will be done by Jose Luis. So please, Sherry, you go first.
Thanks, Sandrine. Can you hear me?
Perfectly clear.
Perfect. And my apologies, I can't put my video on. It's broken. So yeah, my name is Sherry Arnott. I'm with World Vision International, and I'm presenting on behalf of our lead for the Social Resilience Group, Nate Matthews, who was unable to attend today. So we've we've received a number of really great solutions for social resilience that have real potential. And I'm just going to go through a couple of those today. So the first one was around nutrition sensitive social protection. And I think we all know in the context of COVID that the really important role that social protection plays. So this is really about, there's significant evidence on the role of social protection in addressing equity, reducing impacts of shocks, as well as supporting local food markets and producers to function through, during, and after crisis. The second solution was around children's education, and this one is particularly is also really interesting because it's a focus on really on changing the mindsets, behaviors, and relationships to food at a much earlier age. So children as leaders and consumers of tomorrow. So recognizing, sort of building on what Mike was speaking to with the youth leadership team that he's put together. Gender equality. I know that we know that there is lots of work going on across the various action tracks and cross-cutting issues around gender equality, but we thought that was really important to emphasize as one of the key solutions, and recognizing that women play a significant role throughout the food system, and that there's a strong evidence base behind how increasing women's access to control over productive resources plays multiple social and economic dividends. We were looking at it from a social resilience. So I think we just wanted to confirm and reinforce the importance of that, which is already a top priority for the summit itself. I've lost the bottom of the, oh, here we go. So the fourth solution that we had looked at was, you know, food insecurity to be complemented by nutrition security. So to make sure that as we're focusing on food systems, we continue to really emphasize that, you know, both the quantity of food, but also the quality of food that's being produced is really, really important. So it, you know, just to reinforce that nutrition element, which is already a key piece of the food systems framework, but it's important to reinforce that. And then, of course, you know, above all, or as importantly, if not, is the notion of food systems and approaches to food systems being human rights based, and that it's a public good. So there was one of the solutions suggested was that we chose was to launch a process towards universal food coverage. So those basically in a snapshot are the 5 solutions in, you know, in a snapshot format. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sherry. And just for everyone's knowledge, first of all, we've asked, so we received those 120 solutions, game-changing solutions. 20 of them have just come in the last 2 days. The teams are all trying to scramble through all the different game-changing solutions that are being thrown at them. And we've asked them to pick, if possible, 5 from each of their thematic perspective. So what we will do after you have the presentation from each of the chairs is we will then open up for discussion. But let's first have the presentations from each chair. So I see that some of you are already starting to put questions in the chat and also in the Q&A, and Elise and Mimansha will be filtering through all of that for us. And I'm trying to also do the same as I'm reading through. Okay, could I please ask for the next slide, please? And I can't remember now, I think that it was economic resilience.
Thanks, Sandrine. And hello, everybody. I'm Dan Collison. I work for Farm Africa, which is an NGO working in East Africa on sustainable agriculture and livelihood support to smallholder farmers. And I'm glad to find myself in the position of chairing this working group on economic approaches under our resilience action track. We have shortlisted 6 at the moment out of the wide range of suggested interventions that were sent our way. And I'll just quickly run through what they are. I suppose just to preface this with a comment that there's been a lot of discussion in these groups about what constitutes game changing, and I think for us it wasn't necessarily something that didn't have to be brand new. It had to be something that could make a difference at scale. That's one of the main criteria that came through. So the first one we came up with was one of the suggestions around access to finance. Now, access to finance as a category, of course, isn't new to anybody. It covers a huge amount of different possibilities. This particular intervention, though, which has got a particular focus on smallholder farmers and farmer organizations, is about agricultural supply chain de-risking through improving the financial inclusion of smallholders by increasing the amount of climate risk information that they have. Because if smallholder farmers can have more access to and make better use of climate risk information, it increases their bankability. It increases the ability for them to get loans. The point being that incentives for climate resilient practices at farm level make for cheaper credit. So really interesting approach here to improving access to finance and tackling climate mitigation. The second intervention was focusing on in circular economy and in particular tackling food waste and supply chains. There's a really interesting statistic in this submission, which is that 40% of food that's produced worldwide doesn't actually reach a consumer. So this is about thinking about foodways right along the distribution chain. It takes a nice approach that combines health, people and planet, and focus particularly on fruit and vegetable commodities. And it strongly emphasizes the amount of food that's grown locally, interventions to reduce supply chains and increase production in urban and peri-urban areas. Our third intervention is more of a policy level intervention, and this is the incentives for regenerative agriculture. This is thinking about the incentives that around things like soil quality, biodiversity, and land ownership that promote a just rural transformation to climate neutral farming. So not just about kind of market or choice interventions, but the policy approaches that can promote climate neutral farming. Fourth one had a lot of support in our group. And this is the particular set of interventions around strengthening small and medium-sized enterprises. The SMEs that provide such a crucial layer of engagement with smallholder farmers, either as suppliers or buyers or as the providers of extension and advisory services. And the idea behind this being that the stronger and healthier that layer of small and medium enterprises is, then the better the market and the more efficient the market for smallholder farmers becomes. So again, a bit like the first one, a lot of the emphasis here is about de-risking those SMEs to be better in investment bets, allowing them to grow and flourish and really provide a strong market of buyers, off-takers, suppliers for increased yields at smallholder level. What else have we got? E-commerce solutions. Okay, this one actually came from WFP, but quite a number of the interventions had overlap or complementarity, and it was complemented by a submission from the government of Turkey about virtual marketing. We really liked this one. E-commerce solutions does sort of bring together quite a few of the themes around shortening value chains, reducing food loss, increasing, sort of broadening access to markets. And this is all about new forms of market access and digitizing market access for smallholder farmers. It's a really well-developed approach that WFP have described, and could be, I think, for the economic group, could be a leading contender as a game changer. And the last one that we picked out was more, I suppose, about information management and data collection. This was from an Asian NGO network, and it sort of harks back to the food economy model. It's saying that policies and programs really have to be underpinned by the understanding of local context, which is and the collection of data for local context. Data that tells us about access to food, about purchasing power, about land tenure, and that localized data sets are a really important base, not only for policy decisions, but also for civil society action. So yeah, those are our 6 solutions for now, Sandrine. They might change if we get more game-changing ideas in, but that's as far as we've got so far.
Oh, thank you, Dan. That was incredibly thorough and I think gave us a good idea of where you are for the moment. And again, in the chat, there are many people who are starting to ask questions of what exactly are the criteria for deciding what game-changing solutions are. And I think you bring up a very good point, which is that game-changing solutions don't necessarily need to be new. They need to bring impact at scale, But I think many of us are still questioning the granularity of that analysis and how we can move forward. And there's another good point also by Molly in terms of the question of game, using a game-changing solution as the way in which we talk about a key solution for change when we know that this is not a game at all. So I'm hopeful that actually at the end of the presentations, we can give you just one more slide on some of the decision-making methodology that we used, but knowing very well that many of us are struggling as we go through this process and trying to understand what game-changing truly does mean. Dan, I think that you are next in terms of explaining peace resilience.
Yeah, and can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Good, thanks. So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dan Smith. I'm director of the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, and I have the honor of leading the working group that we've entitled Peace Resilience, so that it sits alongside the other kinds of resilience, social, economic, and environmental, which the working groups are on. We have come up with simply 2 solutions, and the reason why we have done just 2 is partly exactly what you were just saying, Sandrine, about this question of how to be at scale and granular, right? So the idea of a food and peace facility in every country that faces a conflict-related humanitarian emergency is clearly at scale. I think the World Food Programme is active in about 80 countries and would define about 50 of those as being essentially conflict-shaped emergencies, maybe some more than that. So this would be a large-scale enterprise, but the point of it is that each of these facilities is a kind of accumulator for different initiatives which are designed in a context-specific way that suit the conditions, the time, the place where they're going to be implemented. So recognizing that while there is often something in common between actions which are attempting to leverage peace building for food security and leverage food assistance for building peace, while there are elements in common between them, there is also going to be significant differences between the different cases. So you have to have this combination of connection between the food and peace facilities and then being essentially autonomous units which work on. There's a number of, well, I think as Sandrine has pointed out, we are in a process of working the ideas out at the moment. So for this one, for the idea of a food and peace facility, while that it's a food and peace facility is a relatively stable idea, defining exactly what situation they would be addressing is something that, as we've discussed it, both internally and with various other actors, agencies, organizations, the World Bank and WFP with FAO and so on, we've started to focus on it not just being about where conflict is active, but about where there is a risk of conflict. And also, of course, where there is recovery from armed conflict going on. So this would also, is an idea that would also fit with and support and enhance the conflict prevention agenda, and it would be about preparedness. The second idea is a global center for risk assessment and policy response. And one of the big things that we want to achieve with this is to link, well, first of all, strengthen risk analysis and risk management. But second, strengthen the link between risk management responses and an understanding of the root causes. And this is essentially, this is a knowledge center globally, probably, and the idea as we're developing it, with a dispersed location. So it would not be just in one place. It would have several different smallish feet on the ground. Possibly one could imagine co-located with food and peace facilities in different places. And it would be responsible for advancing not just the theoretical, but more importantly, the practical knowledge of how to leverage, as I said, leverage peace building activities for food security and food assistance for building peace. So the two ideas sit at different levels, one at a variety of national levels, diverse and around the world, and the other one, a global center, very much knowledge oriented. And I would say that one of the distinctions between the two is that the food and peace facilities, we think of them as being about programming, about what gets actually done, making that more effective, helping there be a learning process between the different activities and the different locations. The global center is more about the policy response, helping the policy be better informed, more far-sighted, and with a better sense of the full track from root causes through to long-term consequences 10 years down the road. I'll leave it there, Sandrine. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Dan. And I think what's really interesting here is that you've really focused on two key institutional changes too, and where there's a lack within the governance framework that we have, and how we can really bring in the element of risk management and facilitate peace in order to create more resilience. And I think both of your suggestions, again, the most important thing here is to bring forward suggestions that we know are truly going to have an impact, and we don't need to have 10 of them. If we have two very core suggestions coming out of your group in the sense that you've focused on here, but we actually get them done, then that is more important than having a slew of suggestions where we know that we're only going to continue to fight due to the complexity of the issues and that we haven't properly unpacked the tensions. And I think it's very important, many of you in the chat are really talking about the terminology. And as we move into the next presentation, I do want to be very clear that none of us feel that we have 100% tap on truth here. We are all struggling through this process because of the complexity of what we're trying to do. And clearly in trying to bring you here and in having this exchange, we're hopeful that we can start to get a much better clarity in terms of the methodology that we should be using, but also really come forward with some effective thinking and action points, proof points, so that we can move into real implementation. So can we move to the next slide, please, and the next group? And Divine, I think you're up in terms of the environmental resilience.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Thanks very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here and equally being the chair of the environment working group. I think environment is actually key. The environment working group is very key in this process of, especially for the Act 5. So there's nothing we're going to do without the environment if the environment is not stopped. That said, with colleagues, we were able to come up with 7 key solution space, whereby we are still brainstorming a little bit, and much more come up with a more comprehensive framework on what we want to see with. Yeah, and the first solution was climate smart agriculture. What are the triple wins of the climate smart agriculture practices, which we thought it would be very, very relevant in ensuring that we have this summit being a success. The second point came up with carbon farming, which was actually, echoed by colleagues, and where we actually seen how to look at the different entry points on how we can merge and cut across all the other working group to make sure that we have a comprehensive and much more sustainable action track 5 solution space. The third point we came up with the ocean-based solutions. So how do we get solutions of the environment through the oceans, from the oceans? So that was very, very important as part of this space and discussions during our first encounter with the team. And we had a food perspective where we're looking at the diversification of food crops. Yeah, where we're looking at seeing how do we make sure that we use diversified fruit crop types of crops like maize to crop resistant, drought resistant crops to actually have impact and reduce. Came up with was increasing adoption of the regenerative grazing management, and the seed point was sustainable integrated farming systems. And of course, we equally had a 7-point which had to do with development. So how do we make sure that the urban and the rural settings are somehow connected in ensuring environmental sustainability and ensuring that there's no gap between the two communities, meaning that the rural cities can become the urban cities? How do we make sure that we join efforts together to address this impact of climate change and ensure that we come up with a resilient and more focus-based solutions? So we really came up with all these points, but I have to underscore here that we are still in a lot of consultation within the group, and that we truly believe that the environment working group has a very big and huge responsibility, because if the environment is not sustainable, we can't be talking about education, we can't be talking about food systems. So I really thank you very much, and I'm open to questions. Over.
Thank you so much, Divine, and it's a shame. It's always difficult sometimes to get perfect connection so that we can really hear you. But we had the slide up, and I think it's very important, again, to look at these key solutions, which for us are also in some ways cross-cutting. And in particular, also, again, looking at the chat, to bring in the fact that we know that many of these solutions have been proposed before. The key here, and this is what we really want to unpack with all of you, is better knowledge of where are the learnings, where we can bring them to scale. How can we ensure that we unpack the key tensions between people, planet, and prosperity, and why these solutions have not been taken up? So we're not exactly bringing up brand new solutions in many cases. As is said in the chat, many of them were even proposed 50 years ago and before by the Club of Rome and by others. So the question is now is, in the next 6 months, is there a way that we can bring recommendations that actually can become pledges and commitments that will really transform countries and communities so that they do truly shift? That is the key question as well that we have with regard to these solutions. If we look at the last slide, I think it's the last one, and I think it's you, Jose Luis, that is presenting on behalf of VALA.
Yes, thank you very much, Sandrine. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. I'm Jose Luis Vivero, Policy Officer working in the World Food Programme, and I'm presenting on behalf of Vala Ragnarssdóttir from Iceland. Also in my anchoring capacities, because as you know, WFP is the anchor agency for this Action Track 5, and Vala couldn't do it, and she asked me to present on her behalf. And just before I enter directly into the 7 ideas that we have discussed, I would like just to emphasize the very relevant debate that is having place right now in the chat, with some key ideas that probably may resonate with some of the elements that some of the ideas, game-changing ideas, or draft game-changing ideas that I'm going to present, but also with other elements that have already been previously presented. And I just want to flag a few terms, like, I mean, changing, or let's say modifying paradigms. And there has been a very interesting post on that. Another one is what Sandrine has just mentioned. We need to work harder and, let's say, to understand better and to overcome lock-ins. And there are some interesting studies, one that was done a few years ago by IPES Food, on the relevant lock-ins that prevent us to transit towards a different food system. Of course, the issue of scalability and scaling up things that we already know that they are working, and that's one word that I like to use, is that we need to think on scaling up massively. Okay, I mean, at national state, instead of just let's say addressing 50,000 or 100,000 people. I mean, we need to really cover as many people as possible for some issues that are relevant. And then another relevant remark is changing unfair rules in the food system, but it's also related to the lock-ins. So I will now go to the 7 game-changing solutions, and I want just to, before going to that, I want to make a disclaimer. I mean, we so far in this in the cross-cutting group, we have just assessed 28 proposals that we have received so far. This is just an iterative process, and we will keep on assessing and receiving ideas from member states and from individuals, from organizations, etc. So this is just a preliminary first screening based on 27 ideas received that we got in our working group. And the first one, it's related to something that is also very important. We don't need just to be focused on technical solutions. Technical solutions that it could either be, well, of course, it could be either be, let's say, generalities, the good solutions that could be applied at general level, and of course, or solutions that could also be applied in specific geographical locations or countries. We also need to be discussing on institutional architecture. You know, the type of institutions, regulations, and policies at global level as well as national level that they are going to implement the technical solutions that will come up out of this exercise. And this first proposal, it's related to that. It emphasized the importance of using previous agreements related to food systems and food security and nutrition, related to voluntary guidelines, and you know that there is an ongoing debate on voluntary guidelines on food systems and nutrition, international treaties like the Plant Genetic Resource Treaty, UN resolutions, and UN declarations that at the end, they are basically the type of consensus-based agreements that they will help us to substantiate a better institutional setup. The second one is related to the financial, to the money. I mean, and it's related to local agricultural transformation, a funding mechanism that it's mainly targeting women and youth people in the countries in need, in order to really provide the seed funds to facilitate those small and medium enterprises, even very small enterprises, to grow and thrive. The third one, it's related to another key element, a hot topic in itself, that is land. Land as the source of livelihoods, land as the source of power, and land as the source of wealth. And there is a proposal that we need to improve the security of land tenure and also land access and access to natural resources that are essential for food production. And that could be done at national level, of course, but also there could be conversations at international level. A fourth point is related to something pretty much close to our hearts, and when we are dealing with resilience, that is early warning systems, in order to act promptly and to have anticipatory actions that they may prevent, strong impacts, and also they may save lives. And at the end, it's also more cost effective. The fifth one is shock responsive social protection programs related to safety nets, but safety nets that, as I said earlier, they should be enlarged massively, covering as many people as possible, especially those that are most in need. But social protection networks or schemes that are shock responsive, that are flexible, that are adaptable, and they can be easily expanded or modified or let's say increased by depending on the shocks that either shocks like floods, droughts, or let's say a displacement. The sixth one is related to what Sandrine, Martin, and Sherry mentioned before on the importance of human rights approach and having a human rights consideration. And it's called the universal food coverage, that it could be a broad scheme to be applied, of course, at national level, paralleling or mirroring the similar schemes that are developed for health and education in most of the countries. You know, you have a universal health coverage. Why not one for food? And the final one, it's an innovative mechanism, the Global Network Against Food Crisis, an innovative mechanism to tackle protracted and complex food crisis. Not just addressing the crisis from the humanitarian perspective, that is the usual one, but also combining a humanitarian approach to save lives, a developmental approach to change life and improve resilience, and the peace-building approach, not just to avoid the triggers of conflict, but also to foster peace in the long term. And over to you, Sandrine.
Thank you so much, Jose Luis. And I think you brought up several dimensions of this, exactly as we had indicated before. And really, we're seeing this coming up in the chat, both in terms of the types of game-changing solutions that we need to look at, you know, the institutional shifts, the technical shifts, but also the governance shifts, and an understanding that we also have to look at this from a moral perspective. And we have some of that also in our questions. What I'd like to do is there are so many questions in the chat around the criteria development, etc. And as some of you have responded from the working groups, you're absolutely right that this is what was asked for by the UN. I'd like Mimansha to put up, or Elise, I think someone from you will put up the slide that we prepared around the criteria that we were given. And then go from there in terms of the key questions we have, and I will pass that over to Salim, because unfortunately I'm going to have to leave you, even though I'm so sad, because I'm really enjoying this conversation, but I have to go and give another presentation. But let's first, Salim, why don't you take over in terms of how we've been looking at the criteria, and by no means do we feel that this is as complete or as deep as it could be. And again, we have to remember, this is the first stage of the discussion and the unpacking of these game-changing solutions. So your comments are all really helping a great deal.
Thank you very much, Sandrine. Thank you for excellent moderation and for keeping the discussion going. I see we have a very rich discussion going on in the chat box. So thank you everybody for participating in that. And as a number of questions have arisen about the game-changing solutions and the criteria for that, we've put up this slide to share with you, and with the caveat, as Sandrine has said, that this isn't the final say. It is a work in progress. It is a means to try to identify the ones that we think have the greatest potential. What we are talking about is a game-changing solution, is a feasible action. It has to be an action which can be sustained over time, that will shift the capacity of food systems to advance global goals. And the key criteria are three. First is the impact potential at scale. It is about scaling up. It could be something that is already being done at pilot level or at a relatively modest level that might be able to be scaled up. So including a return on investment. So scaling up in financial terms, a very important element. The second one is actionability, the feasibility of action. This takes into account the politics, capacity issues, costs of doing things, and we have to make judgment calls on that and to see whether or not we can address them in terms of making the feasibility of the activities actionable. So very much action-oriented points, not just agreeing on agreements on words or activities, but doing things. And then the third one is the long-term sustainability, the ability to keep delivering to 2030 and beyond. So the Food Systems Summit very much is about an action plan to 2030. And the game-changing solutions are all sets of actions that we are receiving from everybody. And as Sandrine mentioned earlier, we are still in receive mode. So any of you who have actions that you want to share, the website is still open. It's a fairly simple modality of sending in your game-changing solutions. It's a fairly 1 or 2 page concept note with some key criteria that you have to put in there, and then we will be able to take them on for examination and filtering through. So let me also add the qualifiers to the three key criteria. The first one is have a positive effect on ensuring equitable livelihood opportunities, advancing human health, and regenerating environmental integrity with a focus on youth, women, marginalized and disabled populations. So we are disaggregating the vulnerable groups, and that is very much front and center for us, particularly I would say in the resilience track, to ensure that the most vulnerable, both at the production end in terms of farmers, fishers, herders, etc., as well as at the consumption end, particularly slum dwellers in the major cities in the developing world, and their nutrition and access to food is in particular an issue. So production and consumption, both ends, most vulnerable communities, most vulnerable people are very much front and center in our analysis of what do we think, how do we qualify the ones that we are wishing to take forward. Then number two is to be a true departure from existing practices that address a long-term constraint, obstacle, or trend. The premise here being that existing systems have proven to be not fit for purpose in many cases, and that we need to be thinking out of the box. We need to be thinking about doing things better and differently, and also at the same time feasible in a political sense of what is possible to do, even though, as said at the very beginning, some people might see them as too difficult. For us, that's not a criteria. It might be too difficult, but we are still willing to push it forward to see whether the too difficult can be examined and perhaps defeated as not being too difficult. And then number three is be ambitious and think big. This is about scaling up with concrete pathways and actions for long-term systemic change. So the scaling up is scaling up in size, in geography, in impact, and then also longer-term systemic changes. Our emphasis on the word system rather than on food alone. Number four is how deliberate impact pathways that account for or minimize or eliminate negative impacts have co-benefits or are mutually reinforcing on achieving the other action track goals. So this point has been made a number of times in the chat box that I've seen. People have been very rightly saying that you can't have things in silos. Everything is connected to everything. We are very well aware of that. In Action Track 5, we have 5 working groups. One of them is a cross-cutting working group, of explicit cross-cutting working group. So within Action Track 5, we are definitely looking at cross-cutting. But then across the other 4 action tracks and Action Track 5, we are also paying very close attention to overlap, synergies, possibilities of cross-cutting across the action tracks. And in fact, I would argue that our action track on resilience is probably the most cross-cutting of all the other action tracks. They tend to have their own sort of grounding in particular areas, whereas with resilience, we have a very cross-cutting one. So we may end up having resilience actions or solutions that actually come from the others, or certainly overlap with the other action tracks. We're well aware of that, and we have an active consultation across the action tracks to make sure that we pick up the synergies early and we work on developing those synergies, not ignoring them. And then we have number 5, they have to be implementable at sufficient scale to reach a large portion of the population with clear, timely, and verifiable outcomes that produce significant impacts by 2030. Again, 10-year timeline to be implemented and to be delivered. I'll make another additional point here that Sandrine has also mentioned, which is that in parallel to our action track activities, all 5 of us, there is a whole set, as Martin mentioned before he left at the beginning, there is a whole set of national level dialogues. I think the number is around 40 already. In my country, Bangladesh, where I am right now, the government of Bangladesh has initiated a national dialogue. They've had the first of 3 that they are going to hold across the different action tracks. And they are developing national dialogues on food systems at the national level as well. And we are hoping that every country will be able to do these national dialogues over the coming months, and there will be a national exercise to come up with national level food system changes. And these will then feed into our overall overarching track. So we are very hopeful that we will have a set of actionable activities at the country level, which countries, national governments, and other stakeholders at the national level will take ownership over and will become the champions of. So a set of national level food system activities is something that we expect to happen, perhaps not in every country, but in a good number of countries going forward. And then We also, number 6 is to be sustainable in that it can persist in the medium and long-term future, something that has a life of its own and continue. And it is able to anticipate and prevent future lock-ins. This is very important. We need to be, whatever we need to come up with has to have some level of adaptability to be able to deal with problems that might arise, to change and adapt as needed, and not to lock in important issues that cannot be then taken out or undone once they are put in place. And then finally, promote gender equality and women's empowerment in food consumption and production systems. As Sandrine mentioned, we have very strong women champions. Every one of the action tracks has a women and gender lead who is making sure that these are well integrated and embedded into our specific action tracks. And the gender champions are also advising across all the different action tracks to ensure that gender issues are very much taken into account. Shall we go to the next slide with the questions? Who's doing that slide?
Give me a
Mimansha?
moment.
Thank you. So we are about to now open the floor for getting your comments, feedback, and questions, which I'm very pleased to see are already happening already, and dialogues taking place in the chat box, which is very nice to know. I've asked our colleague Elise to pick out some of the questions and share them with me, but let me go through the questions that we have put there for your thinking, and you can write them up in the Q&A box. We'll try and answer as much as we can here, but if not, then we will try and provide the answers in the final version that will be uploaded and will be available on the website. So the first questions were, do the solutions proposed address food system resiliency? Please remember, our track is about resiliency, not food system per se, but about the resilience of those systems. Secondly, do the solutions proposed have the potential to drive transformative change in food system resilience across all geographies or across significant geographies, if not all? So multi-country, continental, and potentially even global. And transformative being changing what we have today. So business as usual is not a acceptable modality for us. We need to be doing business as unusual and transforming from where we are today to somewhere better in the future. Thirdly, do the solutions address key cross-cutting levers of change, such as human rights, gender, innovation, and financing? There was a question about human rights, and the answer to that is very much on board. Michael Fakhri is the human rights rapporteur who's going to guide us and is already very much supporting our work and ensuring that we take a human rights perspective. Also, from a very personal level, as the chair of Action Track 5 on resilience, I have a very strong interest in ensuring that the interests of the most vulnerable communities in the most vulnerable countries are given paramount importance in terms of resilience. My basic work is about climate change vulnerability and working with the most vulnerable communities in the most vulnerable countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America on climate change, but it's also relevant for the food systems as well. So I declare a personal interest and bias on that particular issue. And then how can we address the core implementation factors such as technical solutions, governance solutions, institutional architecture, principled and normative narrative, universal right, access to food. These are all things that we have to take into account, and obviously some will be more difficult than others, but we do not want to neglect any of them. And then finally, what in your view is missing in the solutions? Are there resources, data, science-backed evidence to back the underpinning solutions? So this is where I would invite and encourage many of you thank those of you who have already provided them, encourage those of you who have access to relevant information, reports, data that you may have that you'd like to share with us. Our doors are still open. Our website is still open. Please share that information. I see there were also requests or inquiries as to whether or not people could join working groups. We still have a little bit of time and a little bit of flexibility. So if anybody is really keen to join a working group, I'd invite you to send us an email with your CV and your interest in which working group and your experience. And we would certainly welcome good inputs from people who have experience to share with us that will be relevant for our working groups. I'm going to now stop and open the floor, maybe invite Elise, who's been following the Q&A and chat boxes, to maybe pick out one or two questions which you feel it would be good for us to address, and I'll try and address them. Elise, would you like to just
Thank
give
you,
us...
Salim. Yes, there is a question from Peter Hurst, which is also being shared by Aman Sidhu. The question is, how is Action Track 5 proposing to improve the resilience in food systems to ensure the well-being and health of the workers, the people who work in these sectors of food, agriculture, but also fisheries?
Very, very good question. And as I said, this one is particularly close to my heart, because for me, it is the poorest and most vulnerable populations, whether they are at the production end, farmers, fishers, herders, or in the working end, in the business, in small enterprises, or working in even bigger, big companies along the entire supply chain. And then at the other end of the supply chain amongst the consumers, particularly the poorest, most vulnerable consumers who may or may not be getting a good nutritious food at a reasonable price. So across that entire spectrum, we, from the resilience track in particular, have a very keen interest in ensuring that we do address the issues of the most vulnerable, whether they be workers or consumers, farmers, fishers, etc. So that is very central to our, if you like, criteria for selecting. As you know, we are going to have to select out of a very large number of proposals that are coming our way. One of our critical factors in selection is whether or not the solutions that are being presented actually address the needs of the most vulnerable or not. I hope that answers your question.
There's another question, Salim, from Pat Mahan on the impact of COVID-19 on resilience and food security. Do you think we should specifically talk about COVID-19 impacts on the current humanitarian crisis and the solutions that are required to respond to this crisis?
Very, very good question again. So my answer to that would be that COVID-19 is very much integrated into our framing of both the environmental impacts as well as the environmental and economic impacts, and in particular the health impacts that we have already identified. So our framing of resilience is very much a health and food nexus resilience, as well as economic at the same time. And the COVID-19 situation and our coming out of it at the other end, hopefully over time, is really what we are hoping that the UN Food System Summit will be able to add to and enhance the synergies between dealing with the pandemic on the health side, the human health side, at the same time as dealing with the planetary and food system resilience at the same time. Our view of solutions is that solutions need to be cross-cutting and win-wins across the different areas rather than be siloed into particular areas. And I think if there's one lesson about the COVID-19 pandemic globally, is that we are living in a globalized world. Everything is connected with everything else. You just simply cannot isolate yourself and hope to survive and be resilient on your own. Resilience is something that we all have to be collectively resilient, or if everybody's not resilient, then nobody's resilient. Elise, anything else?
Thank you, Salim. Yes, there are quite a few other questions, but I think it would be good to ask them to the working group leads, if you allow us to do that, to open up the discussion.
Sure.
So there's a discussion for the working group working on environment. I think it's for Divine, but also Hunter, if you want to answer that. So there are actually two questions for you, for your working group. One is from Mustafa El Boussini. How do you reduce environmental pollution, in particular in relation to the use of pesticides and chemicals? And that's also linked to how we could transform agriculture and use more agroecology. And there's another question as well for you about the definition of climate smart agriculture. Over to you, Divine.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much for these two questions. They are very, very timely. Yeah, I'll start with the last question. Climate smart agriculture is actually it's an approach. It's an approach where we have to deal with increasing food productivity, climate resilience, mitigation, and adaptation. So it has triple wins, and that's why we feel that climate smart agriculture is the best solution, one of the best solution approaches. Looking at the second question, the first question has to do with getting into agroecology and how do we improve in a sustainable agriculture. I would strongly recommend tree planting and tree growing. Planting fruit trees is going to give a better and a more sustainable way, because if we plant the trees and the trees grow up to be fruit-like, we can cut the trees, fell them down, and go sell them to industries which produce them into juice, and later on transform them, and that gives money, economic and environmental impact to the and social impact equally to the parents of the child to send the child to school. So that is really what I feel with respect to agroecology and agroforestry. Thank you.
Thank you. Is Hunter with us? Would you like to add something on agroecology, Hunter?
Sure. These are all the questions that have been posed, and all of the issues that we're debating are challenging. I put in the chat earlier, there is a yet to be had debate between carbon smart agriculture and carbon farming. What's the difference? We haven't had that discussion yet. And again, let me hasten to say, particularly in the environment group, this is very much a work in progress. We're not yet comfortable ourselves that we have the answers, that the answers that were posted here are the best ones. And that's why we keep saying again and again and again, please send in your suggestions and we'll keep wrestling with this. For example, on tree planting, there are obviously areas on the planet where tree planting is essential. The great work of Wangari Maathai and others have shown the need for this. At the same time, a tree has its biomass largely above ground, some roots in the ground. If you cut the tree and burn it, you release the carbon. Is this carbon smart? We need to debate that. Grass, on the other hand, has almost all of its biomass below ground, and you can cut the grass or graze the grass indefinitely, and all it keeps doing is putting more carbon in the ground. The grasslands of the world are the world's second largest carbon sink after the oceans, and have the capacity to soak up more carbon than is now in the atmosphere. So we have to, on a scientific basis, on an evidence-based basis, have these conversations and then narrow in to what do we mean. Same debate on agroecology and regenerative agriculture. Are we talking about the same thing? Precisely what do we mean? All of these discussions are very, very early days. And as Sandrine kept saying, we welcome your engagement and your ideas. Please keep these ideas coming. Getting this right really could determine whether or not, as a planet, we make it. I mean, the planet will be fine, but will humanity make it? And will all of humanity make it? Bucky Fuller said our goal should be a world that works for 100% of humanity. Many of the ideologies held by some of the people who launched this whole undertaking aren't aimed at a world that works for 100% of humanity. So as we had in the chat, neoliberalism / cheater capitalism versus regenerative economics. Again, this is a discussion we are only just entering into, and we welcome your engagement in all of this. Over.
Thank you so much, Hunter. There are a few more questions for the working group leads, and I think then Sylvie wants to speak. There were actually a couple of suggestions for the working group on fragility, so I'm just going to integrate them together here. One is, how would you integrate the concept of political resilience into your work? And there's another question related to the importance of early warning. So I'm going to let the working group lead answer these 2 points. If that's okay. If you are with us, I believe, Dan.
Dan,
yeah,
you want to take that?
Switching myself back into visibility and audibility. I mean, I think looked at broadly when thinking about fragility as an issue, the idea of political resilience is extremely important because it is it's at the core of thinking about how societies, when it's possible, arrange things so that they can manage a variety of different problems, including issues that we're talking about today, but also other ones like the effects of social inequalities, the effects of economic recession, and so on and so forth, that are all part of resilience. I think that explicitly talking about political resilience in the course of pitching and working for this kind of idea for the food and peace facilities would probably be counterproductive. So I think one needs to be very aware of the difference between what is theoretically in theory and in research is part of the ensemble, and what is viable if one wants to be making a difference on the ground in some very, very different localities and places. In fact, even the term fragility is a difficult term in many contexts that people are referring to when they talk about fragile states or fragile and conflict-affected societies. And sorry, what was the second one? I didn't quite get my note-taking done in time.
There was another question on the importance of early warning systems.
Yeah, I think this is absolutely fundamental, and I think that this would be partly what the food and peace facilities would be about. That's why we're talking about the connection to the conflict prevention agenda, to the whole question of preparedness. That's looking at both on the food dimension, but also on the social dimension, and also on the more directly conflict-related aspects, to look at what risks are emerging, what they're coming from, and how they could be responded to. And then I think at the global level as well, with a centre which is more looking towards the policy issues, to strengthen that up it's a fundamental part of what is needed at the moment. If you look ahead 10 to 15 years, one is looking at a humanitarian burden and a conflict horizon, a peace and security horizon that I won't say it's nightmarish and I won't say it's impossible to manage, but it will be very, very hard to manage, and it includes an awful lot of pain. But that's on the basis of business as usual. If one could understand and anticipate that, then one could prepare against it, both to ride out what we can't avoid happening, but also to prevent some of the worst from happening. So I think that the early warning and the anticipation function are fundamental, both for my working group, both in the on-the-ground peace facility, food and peace facility, and in the more policy-oriented knowledge centers.
Thank you so much, Dan. There is another question from Juan Ramos. I believe this is for the working group working on cross-cutting issues about the importance of integrated landscape management and multi-stakeholder partnership. And there's also another participant really emphasizing the importance of gender and gender balance. So over to you for the lead of the cross-cutting working group, if you're still with us.
Yes.
José
Hello,
Luis.
Elise.
Here
I
you go.
suppose
Thank
that
you.
you're talking, you're referring to
Yes, thank you.
Yes, well, I think that, well, the first thing that I want to mention is that I'm really thrilled on the quality and the diversity of the comments in the chat that I can barely follow up because there are so many things. And so I mean, some of the points are extremely relevant. One of them is already gender, as you has mentioned. And well, gender imbalances, empowering women and girls and adolescents. And also, I mean, all the issues that are trying to address gender inequalities. I think that they're essential because they affect half of the entire humanity. And in our case, you will see we have already in several working groups, I'm sure that there will be different solutions that they will be specifically tackling gender. In my group precisely, just out of the 27, and I want to emphasize that, okay? This is not a completed exercise, it's an ongoing exercise. Out of 27, we got one on specifically financial resources for women and youth. There is another group, it's called One Lever of Change, is fully devoted to gender. And the idea is that we need to incorporate those four levers, human rights, gender, when it says finance, and then I don't remember the fourth one. But I mean, gender is one of those. And the idea is to fully embed ideas, proposals, and let's say components related to gender in most of the actions. That's one point. And at 3 levels, and it's good that this slide is still there, because in the point on how we can address the implementing factors, I think that gender and also, of course, landscape management, that is another key issue relevant. Not that much, I mean, in principle, I think that we haven't seen, at least in the 2 working groups where I've been participating, we haven't seen specific proposals related to landscape management. Perhaps they may arrive to other action tracks, especially the one devoted to either to livelihoods or the one devoted to nature-based solutions. But definitely landscape management is essential for environmental resilience. I don't know if the environmental resilience group, they have received one. But in any case, the key thing is that either for landscape management or for gender or for any other hot topic, I mean, the key thing is that we need to work at 3 levels. And I'm pretty sure that the different levels of change, especially the one on gender and human rights, they will be very active in materializing specific ideas related to technical solutions, related to the governance and institutional architecture, and also related to the principle and normative narratives that we need to take place, and narratives that are related to very essential topics that have already been mentioned in the chat, like agroecology, like community-based interventions, and incorporating food producers as well as consumers in those debates, not just to be restricted to policymakers, UN agents, and scientists, etc. I mean, the key elements of the food system, food producers and food eaters, they need also to participate at those 3 levels: technical, governance, and the normative narratives.
Thank you so much. There's also a question for the working group working on the economy, which is about e-commerce solutions. Do you see e-commerce solutions as being in contradiction with circular economy?
Thank you for that. I saw that interesting question coming up earlier on the chat, and it wasn't something that had entered into our conversation as we shortlisted. I think the interest, they might be, they could also be seen as being complementary in that both, I think, would tend to shorten supply chains, either because they localize production and consumption, or they connect producers more directly to remote consumers. So they both would have potential to reduce food waste, but I can see the point that's being got at there, which is that if the purpose of the localized solution is to reduce waste, to reduce the gap between production and consumption, then the e-commerce could just as easily be projecting producers onto a sort of much more distant but directly connected buyers and consumers. So I don't know whether that's a contradiction or a complementarity, but I like the question, and one that we should consider as we write up these solutions. And that perhaps something worth mentioning. I don't think it's, I'm sure Sandrine would conclude on this as well, but once we've got, you know, a little bit further consensus on these solutions, we certainly will go to the next stage, which is to actually explore and write them up, and particularly get the people who actually proposed them to write them up in a little more detail and help to answer some of these questions. So thank you for that one.
Thank you, Dan. A last question for our working groups, for the working group working on social resilience, looking at nutrition sensitive social protection. How would you look at the scope of these measures that are really targeting nutrition for social protection, and how would you prioritize these interventions?
Thank you. Great question, and quite an extensive one. For social protection, there is, I think the main thing would be to look at it from an evidence base. There's strong sets of evidence amongst in many different quarters around social protection and what constitutes nutrition sensitive social protection. So I think the first thing would be, you know, to go back to that evidence base to look at what is has been shown to be the most effective way to ensure that social protection systems are nutrition sensitive and reach the most vulnerable. So I think that would be the, so without saying which specific interventions those would be at this moment, but there is an incredibly strong both evidence-based, but also I think political will by many governments, because most governments do have some form of social protection or safety nets programs in place. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Sherry. There is now a question for Mike, who is our youth champion. The question is from Ellen Lucas. How are youth leaders benefiting from these solutions? So looking at the role of youth as beneficiaries, but also agents of change themselves. Over to you, Mike.
Thanks so much, Elise. And thanks so much, Erin. I just sent an email to you about school-based agriculture, whereby I'm going to work with a youth from Liberia who is doing that. So as youth, we're benefiting a lot from being part of the action tracks, because we're acting like linkages between ourselves and our fellow youth. And as I presented in my presentation, that I'm going to work with several youth in areas or in countries where are fragile, like Liberia, as school-based agriculture is also based there, Yemen and South Sudan. So the idea is, much as we're talking of resilience, we are also focusing on empowering fragile states, and we can empower fragile states when we are working with the youth from those areas. So I think this is the key benefit which the youth will also benefit from working with the action tracks. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Mike. There are many more questions. We are trying to take as many as possible. There are also questions about the process, about submitting more solutions, about joining the working group. So we're going to type some answers there in the chat with my colleague Mimansha. And I'm now going to hand over to Salim to talk about human rights, but also to close the meeting. Over to you, Salim.
Thank you very much, Elise, and thank you to everybody for some excellent questions. And I think we had a good back and forth. I hope we've managed to answer most of your questions to the extent that we are able to. And as I have mentioned earlier, and as Sandrine has mentioned as well, this is very much a work in progress. We see your inputs as very fundamental to challenge us, to guide us, to put us in the right shape to take things forward in the mandate that we have been given. Everything is in flux. Everything is, trying to get some order out of a lot of complicated procedures and many, many different stakeholders, all of whom we want to listen to, all of whom we want to hear from, but somehow bring some order into that process. So we really, really do want to thank everybody for participating, joining us. Please feel free to get in touch with us. As I said, if anybody wants to join a youth group, a particular working group, then please let us know. We will try and consider it. I can't promise, but we certainly would like to receive advice and input. Please share your information. If you have access to data, information, reports that you feel are relevant, please send them to us. We promise to read everything and take it into consideration. But most importantly, right now at this point in time, we need game-changing solution ideas. So if you have an idea, please send it in. We are still open to receive them, but the window will close fairly soon. So please make that the priority. It's only a 2-page format. You can have a look at the website and see the format and write up your solution in a manner that we can then put it into our list of solutions and have a look at it and consider it with the due consideration that is required. Before I end, let me also pick up on the question about human rights that Elise has mentioned. Absolutely integral as far as I am concerned. As I said earlier, I am very much I'm not a human rights activist or a lawyer, but I am spiritually or personally very much committed to the rights of the most vulnerable. And my day job is working on that in the context of climate change, the victims of climate change in the poorest countries, and in the Food System Summit, the producers of food, the most vulnerable communities and people, and also the consumers of food, the most vulnerable. And that also has a resonance not just in developing countries, but even in developed countries. Very often the poorest, most vulnerable are consumers who are not being given access to nutritious and good food. So the rights issue is very much a governance issue at a local scale in countries, at the local level and the national level. Very often the most vulnerable communities are actually vulnerable and poor because their own national governance systems do not listen to them, do not prioritize them, do not take their interests into account. And this is true whether it's a poor country or a rich country. It varies in scale, but even in the richest countries, the poorest and most vulnerable are the ones that also tend to be the ones that are voiceless. And so taking a good look at all the proposed solutions that are coming and examining them from that perspective of, are they righting this wrong, which is very, very clear across the globe in almost every country. And if they're not, then those that don't, in my view, are less of a priority from the perspective of my action track, which I chair. To the extent that I have any say, I will promote and support the ones that take a rights-based approach to solving the inequities and the inequalities and the injustices that are rampant around the world in the food systems world, as well as in the governance world more broadly. So with that, shall we call it a night, Elise? Mimansha?
I guess so. There was maybe Sylvie as well who wanted to speak.
Yes, can we give her the floor? Sylvie, are you with us?
Sylvie, are you with us still?
I think she's not with us anymore.
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, she is. Oh, okay, sorry.
Here you go, Sylvie.
Sylvie, yes, please. You've been very active in the chat box. Please share your thoughts with us.
Yes, Salim, just want to thank you for this a very nice ending, because The first point to always convey when we talk about resilience to stability, just inclusiveness approaches, is putting small-scale farmers and the poorest that suffer on the front line from food insecurity and malnutrition. They are the main producer of food. 80% of our food is produced, especially in developing countries, 50% worldwide. So addressing their need and listening to them and putting them at the center is the game changer, not only for resilience, but also for sustainability and tackling the multiple crises that we face. So I just want to echo this strongly, that this is at the center of these actors. So thank you for that, and you count on my support.
Thank you very much, Sylvie. We always look forward to your advice and inputs, and very much appreciate that. And I appreciate everybody else. We really do take everything that you've given us since very seriously. We've kept copious notes of everything. We will use them. We will go back to our working groups and take on board all the comments and questions that you raised. And as I said, try and improve the quality of our analysis, the quality of the ones that we pick up to take forward, and hopefully in the end, whatever we come up with will be something that all of you would be willing to support. Maybe not 100%, but maybe not everything, but at least you will find a few that you will be able to get behind and be supporters of going forward. And that's really what I would hope to achieve, is a set of game-changing solutions that all of us collectively can pick a few that we are particularly interested in, particularly want to go forward with. And that really is what the summit is going to hope to achieve. It's not just agreeing on something on paper, it's about taking things forward. And we need a multi-stakeholder approach, from governments to farmers to fishers to people to companies, small and large, to all come together on each of these solutions and take them forward into implementation over the next 10 years. So they're all actionable things that we can be involved in to go forward. So the invitation to all of you is not just giving inputs for the summit, but to stay with us for the post-summit implementation of whatever ideas we are able to get the summit to support and endorse. And hopefully there will be a few that everybody in this call and everybody that you represent will be able to get behind and become part of the implementation of those ideas. And from a personal perspective, that's really what I am looking for, is something that comes out that resonates with me, my institution, and something I can become involved in actually doing things. So the game changing is doing things, not just identifying ideas of what could be done, but taking them to fruition and implementation. And so I invite all of you to stay with us on this journey and continue with us. We may not do everything you want us to do. I give you that caveat, but I hope that we do enough for you to get behind something and then be with us in the making it happen part, which is more important than agreeing part. The agreeing part is, I think, these are all subject to the difficulties of 200 countries and a summit by the UN Secretary General. He will have to handle that. Fortunately, we don't have to handle it. He has to handle it. But then afterwards, in the implementation, I hope that many of you will like some of the ideas and be willing to join forces with everybody else and come together and take them forward. And that, to me, is the innovative part of the summit, is bringing together many actors who perhaps previously did not know each other, were not working together, but are now able to come together and take forward some of the solutions where they have a strong interest in being involved and on the implementation side of it over the next 10 years to 2030. So we're looking at a 10-year action plan and hoping that many of you will find something that resonates that you can then get involved in going forward. So with that, I will conclude thanking my colleagues, Mimansha, Elise, Elizabeth. We have an excellent team, Sandrine, who had to go off to another meeting, and all the other the working group leads who presented, very, very good. The science group who also presented, and the youth vice chair, Mike Kunga, who also presented. So I hope all of you who participated today found it worthwhile. And I thank you again for your inputs, and I hope that you will continue to engage with us. We will have a few more of these open for going forward, and hopefully we'll be able to present more information in the next ones on where we are headed, and always seeking your advice and feedback on everything. Nothing is ever set in stone. Everything is subject to modification if we get good ideas on how to do that. So with that, let us call it a night from my side
Just
here.
an extended
Yes.
note of thanks to Stephanie Hochstetter, who is
Indeed,
our
I forgot Stephanie. My apologies.
and our working group leads.
And our working group leads, indeed, yes. So thank you, everybody. I felt this was an extremely useful meeting. I learned a lot. We got to know a lot of very, very interesting people and organizations and sources of information, for which I'm very thankful. And we will take all of this on board and go back to our drawing board with all of them, and hopefully come up with a better version for the next time that we are able to meet again. Thank you. Shall we close it now?
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, sure.
So, goodbye, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Bye, everyone.